Okay, so I am back several months later to record a proper musical analysis for the music that plays during the stillness ending, Umbra Vale. Uh, this has probably become my favorite new piece from the remake alongside After Daddy. After Daddy feels like a very quintessential Akira Yamaoka track for me because it's got the piano and the spooky noises and the progression throughout it, and then also the drum machine entering. But Umbra Vale is just straight up a gorgeous piece of music, and it's something that I think of. It's a type of piece that I think of when I see. I remember a long time ago when I was exploring the various Silent Hill forums and found a topic where they were talking about the samples that Akira Yamaoka used. There were people who were sort of disappointed to find out that not everything was composed just of stuff that came from Akira Yamaoka's brain. Certain samples that he used on the soundtrack that are so iconic that he didn't necessarily create himself. He utilized in a way and implemented it in a way that it fit the setting of Silent Hill. And I remember people saying like, "Oh, I thought he was a better composer than that," which this section I may end up cutting out of the staying on theme video because it's kind of besides the point of Umber Vale video. But one, I honestly believe that half the reason Akira Yamaoka used so many samples when he was making the soundtracks for the original games was partly because they had such a short turnaround to do, like especially between like Silent Hill 3 and Silent Hill 4. Like he's trying to create these soundscapes and stuff, and he knows the atmosphere he's going for, and it's a lot easier to just a lot quicker to use sample libraries and stuff. Second of all, sampling is an art in and of itself, and not just like creating samples, but utilizing samples. Uh, the ways that he uses the samples on the soundtrack are not just copy paste a lot of the time. Sometimes they are, and again, I can forgive him that with the workflow that they had for these games. But other times, like Blank Fairy, for example, he is manipulating the sample in a particular way. He isn't just grabbing the sample, putting it in a song, just saying, "All right, job done." Uh, but more importantly, more importantly to the reason that I bring it up for the Umbra Vale video, Akira Yamaoka is also like a composer, an instrumentalist, and can write notes and play stuff himself. uh, oh, before we get to that, also, it was part of the style that they asked him to do. Like I think when the first Silent Hill game was getting made, they specifically cited like Nine Inch Nails and Portishead and other artists that use samples as reference points. So, yeah, you get what I'm saying. But yeah, Umbra Vale is an example of a piece where it's like this is just him as a piano player, and it's so gorgeous, and it is such a beautiful example of how simplicity and minimalism can be so effective and so emotionally resonant. Uh, the stillness ending is such a moving scene, not simply because of its place in the story, but also because of how subdued it is. But from the music to the dampening effect of the rain, that gentle rain sound that plays throughout, that gives it that sort of meditative quality. And again, it's just such a beautiful example of how this game is not simply about the horror aspect or the fear aspect. At the end of the day, there's an emotional human story they're trying to tell, and yes, they get scary in the moments that need to be scary, and it gets dark and uh, gut wrenching at certain points for the parts that are supposed to be disturbing and gut wrenching. But the moments where there are these moments like the stillness ending, like all of the endings really, where we're reminded at the end of the day, this is a human story, and we're going to let those moments shine and enhance them and support them in whatever way that we can through everything you see on screen, through the acting and writing, and also through the music. So, I have modified my piano tone a little bit. I've been using a pretty stock piano sound for the Staying on Theme videos. I found one on Studio One called, what is this called? Again, Grand Presence, like a grand piano sort of thing. And it has a little bit more of an acoustic piano quality to it. But on top of that, I've also added a few different plugins or inserts to try and dial in my tone a bit closer to what Akira Yamaoka has for his tone, which I am sure. I'm sure there are people out there who can tell by ear whether or not he's using a real piano or not on the soundtrack. To me, it sounds like he's using a piano because I feel like you can hear the sounds of like the hammers lifting and falling on the piano. But there are also very good samples out there these days when it comes to electronic pianos. So it could just be a very, very good sample. But all that said, I'm going to switch over to the Studio One display really quick so I can show you what I'm talking about. The two things that I applied to this. First of all, I am an amateur when it comes to EQing things. So do not do not use me as an instructive example. But when it comes to a lot of things, I think especially in audio, or at least for me, when I'm learning something, part of the best way to learn is through experimentation. So I threw a Pro EQ insert onto this piano tone to just try to see what I could do with the EQ. The EQ started at just like this straight line in the middle, and then I moved this stuff around to try and dial in the tone. And I know that, well, I loosely know what I'm doing here. The left side of this is going to be more of the bass tones, the lower notes on the piano, and the lower frequencies that you're getting from all of the tones on the piano. And then the right side is going to be the highs, the brighter sounds, the more treble sounds. And after messing around with this a little bit, I determined that Akira Yamaoka's piano tone that he uses on Umbra and on a lot of the tracks on the Silent Hill 2 remake soundtrack is very mid-heavy. It's kind of taking away those lower qualities, taking away those higher qualities, and we're getting more of just the mid-range tones. And it kind of relates to what my friend Andy was talking about in the music discussion we had during my streamed playthrough, where he talked about how when they were making the original Silent Hill 2, there was only so much data on the disc that they could devote to the soundtrack for a PS2 game. And so that is part of why the original Silent Hill 2 soundtrack has this a little bit more muted quality, a little bit more compressed, and why a lot of the piano tones have that more mid-range quality, because the PS2 it doesn't have the data to devote to like these lower and higher qualities that give a lot of character to the sound of the piano, but aren't necessarily essential for hearing the notes that you need to hear. But on top of that, it is also, I think, an artistic choice, especially the fact that he does something similar with what might be an actual acoustic piano on the remake soundtrack. I think he produced the piano that way for the remake soundtrack, both so that it didn't seem completely removed from the sound of the original game, but also because it gives it this more muted quality, this more isolated quality, this feeling of melancholy, this feeling of subdued. And if you had a really bright piano tone, that wouldn't necessarily translate the emotion properly. So besides that, I've also put a reverb on here. I'm just using one of the presets that they have in Studio One, the Cathedral preset. You can see here they've got a bunch of different room styles. Reverb is that, like, not echoey quality, but for anyone who's unfamiliar with sound terms, I feel like that's probably the easiest way into it. Reverb is like the way that a sound reverberates through a room. And so all these presets are specific places that they're trying to emulate through digital means, through digital reverb. And I've selected this cathedral tone because it gives it the sound of being in a cathedral, that big kind of reverberation where you play a single note and it resounds and lasts and doesn't just fade off too quickly. And even that, as I'm talking about it, can relate to the stillness ending, this idea of like that note is going to stick around. It's not just going to fade away. And so those are the two things that I put on here. I'm going to turn them off real quick so you can hear how the piano tone I have sounds naturally without any effects or EQing on it. So that's a pretty standard piano tone. And it's got a little bit of an acoustic quality to it, which is part of the reason I chose it. I like that it has a little bit of that organic acoustic grand piano quality to it. But it's still got that brightness, especially on these higher tones. So if I throw the reverb and that Pro EQ on, well, let's start with the reverb. So that gives us, you can hear now, like there's all this, again, the simplest reductive way to talk about it is like echo, but yeah, that reverberation, like it's being played in a very large room, which is kind of represented visually here by this box. Like you've got this green dot here, this line, which is supposed to be where the listener is placed in the room, and then the red dot is like one of the sources of the sound, the reverb. So that already gives it that more haunting atmospheric quality. Like a lot of creating atmosphere is just picking the right reverb. Now let's add that Pro EQ on that takes out all those brighter tones and leaves us with just the mids. So yeah, we don't have a ton of the lower end, we don't have a ton of the higher end. It's almost like we're getting more of the pure note at the center, and it definitely has less character in certain ways, but again, that muted quality feels appropriate for the emotion that we're going for with this piece in particular, Umbra Veil. So let's finally talk about the piece itself. I wanted to record a closer musical analysis of this piece because when it came up on the stream, I hadn't really prepared any notes for it. I hadn't watched the stillness ending since I first finished the game and just looked up all the endings on YouTube so that I could see what they were like. When I started the stillness playthrough, I wanted to avoid anything related to the actual scene because I wanted to come into that cold. And you can watch that in the playthrough, my reaction to it after going through the whole stillness playthrough and hitting the different notes and items that you find in that to get the stillness playthrough, and how that emotionally compounds over the course of the game. So this, as a piano piece, feels very minimalistic to me. Uh, and again, I've talked before, like with the Magdalene theme, uh, how minimalism or simplicity can really be very powerful in these moments that are supposed to be intimate and moving, rather than having these big sweeping orchestrations or complicated harmonies and soaring melody lines. It feels much more grounded to have this very economic style of piano playing. Listening to it, I almost feel like he might have even improvised it in the moment. I don't know if that's necessarily the case, but it has that very emotive and organic quality to it. So I just looked up the term that I was searching for uh, because I learned it before when working on a piece of music with another musician who knows a lot more music terms and stuff than I do. But there is a specific term for kind of playing freely or expressively, still with it, keeping tempo in mind, but allowing the tempo of the piece to kind of slow down and speed up as feels natural for the piece. The term is tempo rubato, or sometimes just shorthand to rubato. Uh, and the reason I wanted to stop and talk about why, and talk about the fact that I was just looking this up now, is tempo rubato is an Italian term that means stolen time. And that feels very emotionally appropriate for a story like Silent Hill 2. But basically, what playing rubato means is playing very freely. Specifically, I'm going to put this up on the screen, but I'll read it off too. Tempo rubato is a musical term referring to expressive and rhythmic freedom by a slight speeding up and then slowing down of the tempo of a piece at the discretion of the soloist or the conductor. Rubato is an expressive shaping of music that is part of phrasing. So yeah, basically it's saying like, hey, it is up to you as a performer to decide how quickly or slowly that you're going to play this piece. And that is the vibe that I get from Umbra Vale. It feels very rubato, and that you can kind of count out the measures. Like there's still a sense of like, okay, this is in four, or there is a sense of time to it. You aren't like getting more or fewer beats per measure, but there is a feeling of like there's space here, and he's only playing when he needs to, what feels right in the moment, and what pace feels natural, rather than keeping it straight on a beat the way he does with a lot of other pieces of music. Because again, particularly with the original game, there wasn't a ton of room for pieces of music like this. Like the only one in the original game is really Magdalene, because when you're making a game like that, you're trying to generate music that can be looped in the background while the player is playing, or looped behind scenes that haven't been rendered yet. And so there's a lot less room to be as intentional as I've talked about the remake soundtrack being. So what are the notes and chords that he's actually playing? Once again, we're in Akira Yamaoka's favorite key for the Silent Hill 2 soundtrack, C minor. If you did watch my streamed playthrough and what I talked about with Umbra Vale here, you'll notice that these notes are slightly different. Even if you transpose what I did in G minor up to C minor, I initially had it just as which has a much different quality to it. The bass notes, I was essentially correct, just in a different key. You've got C, our root, our tonic note, the 1 in the scale. B flat, the 7. A flat, the 6. And back up to the 7, and then we resolve back to the root. And I do think that is, like, it is interesting how that is kind of reflective of what Blank Fairy did, where Blank Fairy is rotating around these same 3 chords, but that is a chord progression that doesn't resolve. It never resolves. This is doing something similar, just rotating back around these 3 chords, but it is a chord progression that resolves continuously. Like every time it gets to the end of that 4 chord progression, it gets back to the root chord. So he gets this descending and then ascending quality from the bass notes. And this is where that economy of notes I was referencing before comes into play. Because he gets the overall arc of what he's going for through these bass notes, but with the chords he's playing in the right hand, he's able to add these really interesting harmonies. And again, they're very simple in their composition, but because of the way they change the quality of the chord over those bass notes, he creates these tensions and complexities that give the song so much, the chords so much more character than if he just did C minor, B flat major, A flat major, B flat major. Instead, what he does is he starts on basic C minor chord, and it's a second inversion C minor chord in the right hand if the music nerds in the audience are curious. And then he moves that bass note down to the B flat, but that C minor chord stays the same, which gives a quality. It could be a C minor 7 chord, or it could be what it sounds more like to me. It almost gives it this E flat major 6 quality, where it's inverted, so it doesn't feel like we're going up to this. That's sort of where your ear expects us to go, but that isn't the chord he uses for the last chord either. It gives us this more, the harmony has more movement to it than if he was just going. Then the next chord, this is the one I had the hardest time at hearing the specific notes he's playing. I believe it's, so he's essentially playing that E flat major chord, an inversion of it, over the A flat, which creates this beautiful like A flat 7, major 7 suspended chord, like a sus2 or add 9, whatever. Actually, it would be sus because we don't have it. I'm pretty sure we don't have the C in there because that feels like it might be there. It might be there, actually, now that I think about it. Which still, it gives us this very complex chord texture and like has those tonal clusters that Akira Yamaoka really likes. You've got these notes that are close together and just create these beautiful almost dissonances. And again, using just the amount of notes necessary to convey that. Like he's not doing like he doesn't have all these other notes supporting it, although he does have some synth atmosphere in the background that does kind of help support it. But if we're talking strictly about the piano, he's essentially just playing as many notes as he needs to create that harmony. And then the final chord in the progression, it would be very easy for him to just do, and that would be fine. But what he does, he goes from this chord back up to the B flat in the bass, but in the right hand, he plays a G minor chord, which feels so much more melancholy than if it was that B flat, because the B flat is this major chord that feels like, okay, yes, we're going to resolve to something. We're going to resolve back to the C minor, or we could potentially resolve back to E flat. And by choosing that G minor chord with the B flat in the bass, gives us this more interesting inverted chord quality. And then also gives it almost this dominant quality to like confirm we are not going to be going to E flat. We're going to be going back to C minor. But even then, it's not a very classical style resolution. It's just sad. Like it's. I always want to resist the notion that like, oh, all minor chords sound sad, all major chords sound happy, because depending on the context, they can sound very different than those two binary emotions. But in this case, I think it is very much like we are in a place in the story where this isn't going to resolve with a happy ending, and by choosing these natural minor chords, Akira Yamaoka is confirming for us this is like you are going to sit here in this space with us, and we aren't going to make any illusions about the emotional state that we're in right here. So we have this beautiful chord progression, this very simple and even in some ways familiar chord progression. But I've talked a ton about why we use familiar chord progressions in previous videos, so I won't go on about that anymore. And then he starts adding in these melody notes. Again, very rubato. Just playing around in the natural minor scale. And right around here, I think, is where the strings enter, those sulpant strings. Sulpant being a style of string playing where you're playing with your fingers very close, or you're playing with your bow very close to the bridge of the instrument to bring out those like scratchier qualities of the notes. It's a technique used in a lot of horror soundtracks, but I think in these moments he's using it in a very intimate way, like very raw, very imperfect, and it adds to just the heart-wrenching quality of the music and the scene. And then in the piano, he starts doing again, these beautiful harmonies where this essentially a G minor chord over the C minor that gives it this add 9 quality. It's almost like jazz that he's doing right now. But again, they sort of add this nostalgic feel. Like I think a lot of people get a nostalgic feeling from jazz because of these like more complex chords sometimes, or because a lot of the music that we hear most often from jazz, for people who aren't specifically jazz listeners, is from like the 30s, 40s, 50s, and so naturally is going to make us feel nostalgic. But yeah, they just like, again, I've talked before, I think, about how like major or seventh chords, the chords built on the root and the seventh scale degree. And if you have the full triad, the root, third, fifth, and seventh, like that's your minor 7. And this is a major 7 chord. And they have I always feel like they have this feeling of longing, which again, incredibly appropriate for a moment like this in the game. And then we add that gets that second scale degree that Akira Yamaoka loves so much into it. So he goes... That little phrase there just sounds... I know I'm gushing a lot about this piece, but it's such a like simple, like pretty sounding thing. And again, I think it's like he uses all this very consonant, familiar sounding stuff because it somehow like strengthens the emotional feeling of what's going on. Add in the octaves for more drama. And here's where the shift happens. We go from this very heartfelt, moving piece of music to tension. We've got that dissonance, or that clash between the 5th and 6th scale degree, which again, Akira Yamaoka loves utilizing this sound. It makes up the entire basis of L's theme in Silent Hill Homecoming, if people are familiar with that soundtrack. And here, it signals the shift in the stillness ending from James and Mary having this very emotional moment to James having to decide what he's going to do next. And we get an octave on the 5th scale degree, octave on the 6th scale degree, octave on the 7th scale degree, then back down. And the atmosphere in the background on the actual track starts to intensify, supporting the ominous nature of this moment. And then we get what I think of as, again, like that Beethoven type chord, kind of like what we got in Laura Plays the Piano. It almost feels like the tolling of a clock very end of the piece. Adds in this little bit of melody. And that's the whole piece. And it delivers. It does exactly what it needs to do for that whole scene. The only other thing that I thought to mention about this one is it has the quality of I always go back to the Moonlight Sonata when it comes to a lot of this music, because I think that is a lot of what Akira Yamaoka is capturing. I talked before about how Bach, I'm pretty sure I read, was an influence of his, but I think Beethoven absolutely also was, because of the way that, like, the end of the Moonlight Sonata ends, not in C minor, but I'm transposing it to C minor. It just ends with this. Can't remember if those are the exact notes. But the reason I bring it up here is Umbra Vale sounds very much like the Moonlight Sonata on the original sheet music, like the original way that Beethoven wrote it and notated it. It was basically just hold the damper pedal down. Now, the damper pedal is what or the sustain pedal is what a pianist uses when they want those notes to ring out over each other. Like, that's without the damper pedal. That's with the damper pedal. Basically, what's happening is in an acoustic piano, you have these dampers to these pieces of felt or like some sort of cushion that lay on the strings to keep them from ringing out too much. Because if you just hit them, then they're just going to resonate. And so if you want to play something that's more like something more staccato or broken up like that, then you don't want those strings to just keep ringing. But if you want a piece to sound more flowing or more connected or more legato is the Italian term, then you hold that sustain pedal down. So that's without the sustain pedal, the damper pedal. That's with it. I hit the notes, but they're still ringing out. And Moonlight Sonata was just like, I think the original notation that Beethoven wrote was hold the damper pedal throughout, basically, which you wouldn't necessarily do on a contemporary piano, because contemporary pianos are made with like state-of-the-art materials, and if you just hold that damper pedal down for the entire piece of music, then there's a very good chance that those notes are going to start to clash with each other, and there's going to be too much noise going on. But I think I remember one of my music teachers in school talking to me or telling us about how, like, or maybe it was even one of my piano instructors, with the pianos that they had in the 1800s, the pianos that Beethoven would have been playing on, the strings didn't have that quality. Like, they did resonate, but they weren't going to the notes weren't going to last as long. And so Beethoven, when he was writing it, knew that if you just held the damper pedal down, like, the notes were going to fade out with a regularity where you would get that quality that he was looking for without it becoming muddled. And the Umbra Vale sounds like that. It's also part of why I chose this specific piano tone on Studio One, because the other one I have does sound more like a contemporary piano, but this Grand Presence piano tone struck me in that, like, initially, like, the sustain on the notes wasn't that long, and that was a concern for me. But then when I started thinking about the qualities of Umbra Vale, I did end up adjusting just like the speed at which the notes fade out a little bit, but they still fade out quicker than the other piano tone, which means I can just hold the damper pedal down as I'm playing all this stuff. And the notes from that previous chord have already faded out enough that they aren't going to be too much of an issue as I move between the chords. And doing that, holding the damper pedal throughout, gives this feeling of like, oh, part of it too is you're supposed to be playing this piece of music soft. Moonlight Sonata in particular, it's like, I can't remember exactly what the dynamic marking is, but the idea is that you are playing softly enough that those notes aren't going to resonate too long. And so holding the damper pedal down is never going to be an issue. Like if you're banging out the chords on the piano and holding down the damper pedal, then there's a much greater chance, even on those older pianos from the 1800s, that there's going to be dissonance and noise before very too long. But if you're playing softly, then holding that damper pedal down is not going to be as much of an issue. And even that, again, I think about the ways that that can resonate thematically with what's going on here. This idea of holding on, staying. I don't know if there's anything else in particular. I already think I've recorded way more. Oh my gosh, did I record 45 minutes? Holy shit. This is way more than I ever intended to record for any of the Staying on Theme videos. But this piece of music to me is such a beautiful piece of music, as are like all of the endings have really beautiful pieces of music. I don't know the names of all of them, but I was specifically thinking about like when I played the Bliss ending on stream, I was struck by how beautiful that music is too. It has a little bit more of an unreal quality to it to go with that ending, but it's a piece called Nocturnal Mirage, and if you're curious, definitely check that one out too. That's one that I might go back to actually. But again, this piece of music is so successful at what it does that I really wanted to dig into every piece of why that is. And we'll see how much of this video ends up on the cutting room floor. But if you've ever been interested in the piano, this is such a beautiful piece to kind of take some of that instruction from. Like, what are the different ways? If you've ever wanted to play like Akira Yamaoka, because this is essentially a solo piano piece, it brings to the forefront all of his qualities, not just as a composer, but as a piano player. And I think that's part of why I love it too, because in that way, it is one of the most personal pieces on the soundtrack, I think. He's so exposed. The piano has still been treated in certain ways, like with reverb and the EQing, and there's still other things underscoring the piano, like the atmosphere in the background and some of the darker synth sounds that he uses. But when it comes to the central focus of the piece, it is a beautifully raw and exposed sound that, again, grounds this incredibly raw human emotion that takes place in this scene.